Okay, so what I want to talk about in this lesson are some of the uses of radioisotopes, and we'll particularly focus on their use in archaeology. So radioisotopes are very, very useful. They're used in archaeology in carbon-14 dating, which we'll go into now in a little bit more detail. And just in subsequent lessons, we'll talk about how radioisotopes are used in medicine. So cobalt-16, for example, is used in radiation treatment for cancer. That same radiation can be used to preserve food. You can blast the food with radiation and it kills all the microbes and any insects that are present. And then also as well, there are radioisotopes that are used in smoke alarms. Americum uh, is a particular isotope that can be used. It ionizes the air, causes an electric current in smoke alarms, and when that ionization process is interrupted with smoke, for example, when it gets in, it causes an alarm to go off as well. And again, we'll talk about those in a little bit of detail as well. But what I want to focus on in this lesson is the use of radioisotopes in what's known as carbon-14 dating. And this is used in archaeology to date items in a particularly reliable way as well. And that's what I want to talk about in this lesson. So if we think about carbon-14, so carbon, we have the elemental carbon, and carbon is the backbone of lots of different organic molecules that make up animals and make up plants as well. And it's also present in the atmosphere as well as CO2. So you have carbon dioxide. Now this carbon here, it can be made up of all different types of isotopes. And if we have a look just in this, so you have carbon-14 is a particular isotope. You also have carbon-12 and carbon-13. The most common isotope of carbon is carbon-12, but there are isotopes of carbon-14 and carbon-13, for example. Now the thing is with carbon-14, so when you have carbon in the form of carbon-14, it's radioactive, as in it breaks down. Its nucleus spontaneously breaks down. So that breakdown happens in a very reliable and predictable way, and it can be used to date. It can be used to date items, for example, that have carbon in them. So to understand carbon-14, we need to kind of think about, if we think about the air around us. So if we think about air, so air is made up of, you have water vapor, which is H2O, you have oxygen, and you have nitrogen, and then you have carbon dioxide. So the question is, first of all, if we focus on carbon dioxide, so the air contains carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide, the carbon within that carbon dioxide can exist as any of these isotopes, carbon-14, carbon-12, or carbon-13. Now the question is, where does carbon-14, where does this carbon-14 isotope of carbon, how does it form and where does it come from? Well, what happens is, when you take the sun, so if you take the atmosphere all around us, for example, it's constantly being bombarded by cosmic radiation. And that cosmic radiation can be many different things, many different types of particles. It can be electrons, it can be nuclei, it can be protons and neutrons, and then you can also have neutrons as well, just these single subatomic particles that come along. And what happens is you get these high energy particles like neutrons, and what they do is they are constantly streaming down from the sun and they're constantly moving through our atmosphere. And what happens is they actually come into contact with everything. But in particular, they come into contact with the nitrogen in the air. So if we have a look here, so this is nitrogen. This is how it looks on the periodic table. We see that its atomic number is 7, so it has 7 protons in its nucleus, and its mass number is 14. Now, what happens is these high energy neutrons that are coming from the sun, they come into contact with the nitrogen. So imagine you have nitrogen that's in the air. These neutrons, should I say, they come into contact and they collide with the nitrogen that's in the air. And as a result of that, what they do is they actually knock off one of the protons. So it has 7 and 14. So it knocks off one of these protons. And as a result of that, its atomic number changes to 6. And if the number of protons changes, it changes into a different atom. So it changes into carbon. So now this nitrogen has one of the protons has been bumped off by this high energy neutron that's coming from the sun. And what happens is that neutron, it's taken up by the atom, and it replaces the proton that was knocked off. So what ends up happening is the mass of this atom doesn't change. So you end up with carbon, and then you have this high energy atom, which is this high energy, or this proton that's released, which is essentially a hydrogen nucleus. So you have this subatomic particle that's knocked off. And what you end up then is you end up with this. You end up with carbon 14. So this carbon 14 is in the atmosphere and where it comes from, it basically is made by these high energy neutrons coming from the sun, colliding with nitrogen and changing that nitrogen into carbon 14. And this carbon 14 then is in the atmosphere. So like what we see here, so this is kind of the process. We go through the process here. So you have the cosmic radiation. So N14, which is nitrogen, captures a high energy neutron and undergoes conversion to carbon 14, and it releases one of these, it basically releases a proton, which essentially is the nucleus of a hydrogen atom. So it releases this proton. So this is what you get. And then as a result of that, then in the atmosphere, then you're going to have carbon 13, you're going to have carbon 14 and carbon 12. And what will happen is these will come into contact then with oxygen within the air, and they'll form CO2. So that's one of the sources, if you like, of CO2 in the atmosphere. We also breathe out CO2, and so do other animals. They also breathe out CO2. But nonetheless, what ends up happening is you have this CO2 that's in the air. And some of that CO2, the carbon within that CO2, some of it is going to be carbon 12, carbon 13, or carbon 14. Now what happens then is that this CO2 then, plants absorb all 3 isotopes of carbon as CO2 during photosynthesis, and animals then also absorb carbon 14 when they consume the plants as well. So what happens to this? So imagine I'm a CO2 molecule. This is me, and the carbon that I have is a carbon 14. So that gets absorbed into plants. So now this carbon 14 is within the plant, and then the plants are also consumed by animals. So what happens is this carbon 14 isotope is moved around, let's say, from plant to animal. Now the thing is that once this carbon, so let's say once this carbon is taken up by a plant or it's taken up by an animal, if the CO2 contains carbon 14, that carbon 14 is going to start to decay. So carbon 14 is unstable, and what happens is it starts to decay. So carbon 14, it starts to break down. Now, while the plant is still alive and the animal is still alive, it'll just keep taking in CO2, or the plant will just keep taking in CO2 from the air, and the animals, for example, will keep eating the plants. And what will happen is whatever of the carbon 14 that has decayed, that will be replaced by more carbon 14 because it's consuming. For example, the plant is all the time taking in the carbon 14. Now what happens then is, so basically what's going to happen is that the ratio of the carbon 14 that's in the alive plant or the alive animal is going to be very similar to the ratio of carbon 14 that's in the air. So as we see here, so we have we have a tree here, and we have, for example, a cow. So while this tree is alive, it's all the time taking in carbon-14, for example, as part of CO2, as it absorbs it into its leaves as part of the photosynthesis process. And as a result of that, the amount of carbon-14 will remain like almost like in the same ratio as the amount of carbon-14 that's in the air. And the same with an animal while it's alive. The animal while it's alive is going to be eating grass, for example, which takes in this CO2, and as a result of that, it's going to have carbon-14 within its body. And that carbon-14 will be constantly replenished as the animal continues to consume and eat plants that have also taken up the carbon-14 from the air. Now, what happens, as I was saying, is that carbon-14 is unstable and it spontaneously breaks down. So carbon-14 it's a radioisotope, and it emits beta particles, and it has a half-life of 5,730 years. So its half-life is equal to 5,730 years. So that's the half-life of carbon-14. So if you think about then, let's say, for example, when this animal dies, what happens is it stops replenishing the carbon-14 because it's not taking it in anymore. The plant, for example, is not taking in the carbon-14 from the air because it's not alive anymore. And then as a result of that, whatever carbon-14 has accumulated within the plant or within the animal, it starts to undergo this beta decay. And basically what happens is so let's say you start off with so the animal dies and it has this amount of carbon-14. And then let's say after 5,730 years, this is going to be half. Okay, and then after another 5,750 years, this will be halved. So again, as time goes by, the amount of carbon-14, let's say within the remains of the plant or the animal, will continue to reduce by half, in line with the half-life of carbon-14. And then this then can be used as a predictable way to figure out how old a particular animal is. So imagine, so let's say, this here represents an alive plant or animal, carbon-14. So let's say this here represents the amount of carbon-14 that's present in an alive plant or animal. Now, while the plant or animal is still alive, this will remain at this level because the animal or the plant will be constantly taking in CO2, and it'll be replacing it. As the CO2 is breaking down, it's being replaced. So it stays at this constant level, okay, or this ratio. And then over time, when the plant or the animal dies, it stops taking in the CO2, it stops taking in the carbon-14, and then as a result of that, the carbon-14 undergoes its natural process of beta decay, and it starts to break down, and it breaks down in a predictable way. So what you can do then is, if you're an archaeologist, you come along and you find a bone, for example, you can measure the amount of carbon-14 that's present in the bone. If that, like, depending on how much carbon-14 is present, like if there's half the amount of carbon-14 that should be present in a live animal, then you know that bone is about 5,730 years. And again, if there's quarter, if there's quarter the amount of carbon-14 present in the bone, it's going to be double that. It's going to be over 11,000 years old. So that's essentially how for example, radioisotopes such as carbon-14, they can be used to date, for example, animal remains or plant remains as well. And also as well, they can be used to date anything that contains carbon in it. So if you think about, for example, paints and different things like that, those paints will be animal or plant based, and as a result of that, they'll contain carbon. They'll contain carbon 14, and again, from the amount of the carbon 14 that's present in the artifact that you find, you're able to kind of work back and see, okay, how much carbon 14 is present, and how does that amount of carbon 14 that's present in the artifact compared to the amount of carbon 14 that would be in a live animal or a live plant. And that then can be used as a basis to basically date items. And this is what's known as this process of carbon 14 dating. So a way to kind of think about it is that older remains, so let's say so here you have all of like different bones and things that are found in the ground, and so older remains will have less carbon 14 than younger remains. So let's say if the amount of carbon 14 that's present as that drops down, the less carbon 14 that's in the remains of something that's found, for example, the older that item is, because it's undergone beta decay. The carbon 14 has broken down and undergone beta decay. So hopefully that kind of introduces and makes sense of one of the uses of radioisotopes, such as carbon 14.